lecture about redistribution without the French girls. Okay, so today we're going to try to apply monopoly theory to a very important social problem, which is the growing inequality in the United States, especially compared with the rest of the developing world. And I'm going to try to argue that even someone who's quite libertarian or who has libertarian instincts might value redistribution because of the insurance that it provides that people would freely have chosen to take up had they had the option to do so. And I'm going to use that as a basis for arguing that optimal redistribution should aim to maximize average utility. And that because utility is usually concave, people are usually risk averse, this means that the poor put more value on a dollar than the rich do. And I'll argue that logarithmic utility is a very nice approximation for this. So then we're going to build a framework for analyzing optimal taxation. And we'll use that to derive two things. First, we'll talk about the optimal linear tax rate, which is sort of the average tax rate that any taxpayer, any ordinary taxpayer would pay. And we'll calibrate the actual size of that we can plug into the formula using a log logistic distribution of income. We'll then also talk about a sort of special surcharge tax for the wealthy, which has been a discussion of a lot of interest in the media recently about President Obama and the Republicans fighting over whether millionaires should have to pay higher taxes or not. And we'll use a Pareto distribution of income at the top end to calibrate that. We'll then talk about evidence about the other key parameter, which will be the elasticity of labor supply. And finally, I'll wrap up by talking about some concerns in thinking about optimal redistribution that this analysis ignores. Okay, so income inequality comes in three basic forms, and these have to do with which part of the distribution we're talking about. So poverty, which is typically measured by the fraction of people that are below some poverty line, which is actually either relative to the national income or in some sense absolute, but usually it ends up moving as the national income moves, so it's really relative, really measures how much inequality there is at the bottom of the distribution, right? Now, the global poverty line is that people earn $1 a day. In the US, that's like insanely below where the US poverty line is. The US poverty line is almost 100 times that much. And the interesting thing is that while we'll talk about inequality has been growing in the United States in some senses, poverty has not really been growing in the United States. It grew a little bit during the 1980s, not at all during the 1990s and 2000s. On the other hand, there's a second measure of inequality, which has to do with sort of over the middle range. How much are sort of the relatively wealthy doing relative to the relatively poor, not people at the extreme who are either in poverty or extremely rich, but sort of over the mid-range. And this is usually measured by the Gini Coefficient, which describes how far a distribution is from perfect equality. And let me give you a little graphical illustration of this. So what we have along here is people ranked from being the poorest to being the richest. And what this line is, what this curve is it says all the people below this level, how much of the national wealth do they own, right? Or how much of national income do they have? If people all had the same income, we would just be at this line of equality here, right? Because 50% of the people would have 50% of the wealth. But if 50% of the people only have 20% of the wealth, then this is going to be below. So there's an area A here, which is how much total amount below is there. And then there's an area B here, which is how much is below this curve. And the ratio of A over the total area is the Gini coefficient. So So that's a good measure of sort of mid-range inequality. But then notice that this will not differ very much. Imagine that we get up to here. For any given difference here, whether the absolute richest people have most of it or whether these guys here have most of it won't really affect the Gini coefficient very much at all, right? So we have a third measure for the very richest, which is called top income shares, which says what fraction of national income is taken by, say, the top 10%, by the top 1%, by the top 0.1%, et cetera, right? And Gini coefficient has been going up a little bit in the United States, but not that much. And most of it was during the 1980s. The thing that's been just skyrocketing continuously is the top income shares. So the wealthiest 1% relative to the wealthiest 10% have been getting enormously more of the gains. You can sort of think of the wealthiest 10% as being roughly what you would earn if you choose sort of one of the less lucrative careers that you as a University of Chicago graduate could choose. Being a teacher or, maybe being not such a well-paid doctor or something like that. Whereas the top 1% is what you would earn if you go to Wall Street or something like that. And top 0.1% is what you'd earn if you're successful on Wall Street, right? So just to show this, so this shows the share of national income that's earned by various groups. First, by the people who are between 10 and 5%. And you see, this has been pretty darn flat over time. It went up a little bit during World War II. It came down towards the end of World War II. And then it sort of slowly rose till the 70s, and then has been almost completely flat since then. So there's nothing going on there. How about the people who are between top 5% and top 1%? Well, these guys have been going up a little bit, particularly during the 80s, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. The huge thing is what's going on with the top 1%, people earning over $370,000 a year. So that was huge during the Gilded Age. It then came plunging during the Great Depression, continued to fall through the 70s, and then right around 1978 started absolutely skyrocketing and is now up at almost a quarter of national income is captured just by the top 1%. The top 1% of the economy captures 25% of the national income. That's more than, that's almost more than the combination of the next 9 percentage points. So between 10 and 9 are earning about the same as just the top 1% is. Yeah, Matt?
What made it rise so quickly in 1978? Was that something that happened or just sort of?
Do you want my personal theory? I mean, there's huge disputes about this. Okay, so some of the theories that people say about this are that with the rise of, information technologies of various sorts, it's increasingly easy for the absolute top people to reach a large number of people. But I don't think that's really very persuasive because I think that most of this has been going on in the financial sector, and that's not what's been going on in the financial sector. Another explanation is that there's an increasing premium for education, but I don't think that explains it because you see these people who are sort of the educated people, they're not doing any better. It's how much the exceptionally rich educated people are doing relative to the other people. So to me, it's all about finance. And why have things been changing in finance? Well, I basically think that there's been a lot of reduction in taxes and that lead people to go into finance, and a lot of deregulation that lets people make a bunch of money in finance. And why has that happened? Well, I have theories about that too. But anyway, Connor.
Is there data that describes the occupational distribution of people?
Yeah, there is. It's by this guy, Stephen Kaplan, and there's one other guy, Thomas Philippon. They're the two guys who have worked on that. And it is. It's all the higher you go up, the higher fraction it is in finance. I think in the top 1%, it's a third are in finance. I think in the top 0.1%, it's half are in finance. I think in the top 0.01%, it's 85% in finance or something like that. Yeah.
Isn't a lot of the top income earned by CEOs?
No.
No?
It's all there are some CEOs who earn quite a bit, but most CEOs don't earn that much. and most CEOs could earn more if they worked in finance than if they worked as CEOs. But I mean, if you think about it, this is one argument I always have against people who think we should like cap CEO pay, which I don't support, because all those CEOs would just go into finance instead. Like, I'd much rather have them running a real business and doing something than going into finance. Because like a CEO, even of like a really big company, you look at somewhere like HP, those people earn like what, like $20 million a year? What does like someone who does really well in finance earn? Like $300-400 million a year. Like Cliff Asness at the height of like when he was making money, I think brought in $500 million just running one hedge fund. So, you know, I think the CEOs are pretty undercompensated relative to the people in finance. Now, the interesting thing is that this has not been happening at all in Europe. So if you look at France, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Japan, they all had just as high, this is the top income share, top percent income share. Notice this is basically the same as what it was in the US in the 20s. And then they fell. And they're tracking us right up until 68. 68, 10% here. 68, 10% there, right? Then the US goes like that, and all these countries keep falling gradually, right? And on a global scale, something very similar to this has been happening as well. So many libertarians and conservatives oppose redistribution of wealth to try to compensate for this growing inequality. And I used to be a libertarian, so I sort of empathize with some of these arguments. So let me try to portray some of them to you and then tell you about what it was that eventually persuaded me to change my view about this. Okay, so one simple view is that people say the rich earn their money, you know, who has the right to take it away from them? It belongs to them. Another argument that you hear quite often is a sort of social Darwinist argument, which is that, like, you know, the poor people will sort of waste the money anyway, or that the rich are the best people at starting businesses, and you know, it's good to put the money in their hands because they'll invest it in something productive. Another argument that Robert Nozick made is that, look, it doesn't matter what the outcomes of a situation are. What matters is that there was fair set of transactions that happened between us along the way. And therefore, anything that happened through a fair set of transactions is in the end fair. The Protestants have an idea that, you know, wealthy are God's chosen people and that it was God's will to make them wealthy and you shouldn't interfere with that. Ayn Rand says that taxation is basically a form of violence and that property is an inviolable part of, you know, the individual person. There have been fascist arguments that basically the attempt to redistribute wealth breeds resentment between different classes and reduces the solidarity and therefore productivity of a country. There are conservative arguments that sort of each part of society has its role to play that's been established by, you know, many, many generations, and that trying to interfere with that actually reduces sort of the efficiency of the economy because people sort of don't know what to do in these different mixed up positions. So I think actually these arguments are more powerful than they might superficially appear. And not all of these have actually been completely formalized as economic ideas, so they're interesting things to study. But even though I used to sympathize with many of these arguments, I eventually came to be much more sympathetic to redistribution. And the reason was basically a libertarian, I think basically libertarian argument for redistribution. And it's very closely related to a classic Christian saying by John Bradford. So he was sitting in his comfortable apartment and he saw these people being dragged through the streets in chains, you know, going off to the workhouse or whatever. And someone said, oh, isn't it terrible, all these criminals being dragged through the streets? And he said,